So starting off the same way that we did last time with these working agreements, which I think there are absolutely essential when you're going to be engaging in any sort of conversation that may be difficult for some folks or have people feeling some discomfort. You don't have to use these ones. These are just ones that I like to use. Welcome to use any number of them. Strive for intellectual humility. Be willing to grapple with challenging ideas. Differentiate between opinion and informed knowledge, which comes from sustained experience, study, and practice.
Mm.
Let go of personal anecdotal evidence and look at broader group level patterns. Recognize how your own social location, your race, your class, your gender, your sexuality, and I was doing a presentation today to system leaders. And so then I also said your location within um, our educational systems, which have a very clear hierarchy. These all these things inform your perspectives and reactions to students and those with whom you work. Differentiate between safety and comfort, accept discomfort as necessary for social justice growth, and identify where your learning edge is and push it. So this is where I'd like folks to go today. I'm going to send you into, oh no, not the breakouts this time. I'm going to ask you to comment in the chat again, like you did last time. What I noticed in the comments, because I didn't read them during the presentation because it's really hard for me to do that, but I took a look at them after and I saw that a lot of folks commented on being tired. And I really appreciate that. I know it's been a long day for everyone. You got up early, got started working. I don't know if you had a rough start to the morning. I don't know if you have a sick child or partner at home. I don't know if something happened at your workplace today that made it a little rougher than usual, or maybe a bit brighter than usual. And then I don't know, everyone who's here, what your own educational experiences connected to Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples and communities might be. So some folks who are here, I know that this is your lived identity, and other folks here, that's not the case. And I don't know what your relationships are. So I'd like to invite you to think for a moment of putting the two words in the chat like last time, but connect them to those words to how you're arriving to this session today. I'm just going to pause for a moment to give you an opportunity to do that. Thanks. I see some about learning, some tired but ready. I like that. Thank you. Yeah, we can be tired and hopeful at the same time. Thank you. I have a great deal of gratitude for the opportunities that I have in doing this work that I do and connecting with different people. So I feel very grateful. And I'm grateful to all of you for showing up here tonight, too. Thanks. So a little recap, because I just want to touch on what we spoke about last time, but I don't want to spend time on that because, as a number of folks said last time, that that hour goes really quickly. So we talked about some defining terms. I asked folks to think about what's your why in engaging in this work in anti-colonial or decolonizing and anti-racism work. A reminder that it's not of the past because it happened to have some very timely examples of anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism that had been in social media right before last week's presentation. And then I asked folks to make a commitment to what you'll be doing for your own learning. And I noticed quite a few people said that they would be taking a look at some reading. They might be listening to some podcasts. Think about how you uh, make something into a habit. You know that we understand about how habits are things that we can train ourselves to be doing all the time. And maybe one of the habits that you put into place for yourself is 10 minutes every day of some new learning in anti-racism or anti-colonialism. And it could be as simple as those of you who are parents, what picture books or chapter books do you choose to read with your kids? That could be your point of learning together. It can be the resources that you're using in class. It can be what podcast you're listening to when you walk the dog or you're doing the dishes, anything like that. Find those little ways that you can have those entry points into engaging in the work. If you have not read Bettina Love's We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom, highly, highly recommend it. This is another one of the titles that was on my podcast, Anti-Racist Educator Reads. Such a powerful book. I love how Bettina Love really makes it super clear and accessible how people can do the work. And that work is not focused on just understanding white privilege, because that's not going to bring about justice. So here's the question that I left you with last time to think about. How does knowing our past impact our present and our future actions? So here's where I'm going to send you off into some breakout groups. I'm going to stop sharing this right now. Come back and I can see you. So you had a little bit of time to think about that because I gave you that question last week. And if you didn't, if you're new, if you missed last week and you're just here, I think that you just think about your own practice and your own work that you've done in education, and how does knowing our past impact our present and our future actions. So what I just want you to do very quickly in a group, and remember last time that it's really fast. So make sure that you give everyone who's in the group an opportunity to engage in the conversation. What does this mean for you in your own learning, in your own practice, or perhaps in your personal life? Going to set up those breakout rooms. Assign automatically. It's going to make sure that there's only, so there's going to be 2 to 3. So I'm just going to give you 5 minutes for that. Okay, I'm just creating those now. All right, 5 minutes, setting my timer. And pausing the recording.
The past can, if done right, prevent mistakes in history being repeated. We talked about sometimes knowing your own roots can create connections and empathy. We talked about how, especially with things like truth and reconciliation, knowing the truth in terms of the past and the history is like the very first step in terms of healing. So those were some of the things that came up in my team.
Thanks, Pauline. One more person. Someone who was in a different group than Pauline. Oh, Harpreet, thank you.
I can go. So without getting into details, we talked a little bit about our knowing our parents' history and knowing the struggles that they had to go through from where they came from and the discrimination and racism they faced, right down to how they named their children so that they would have an easier time, and knowing the history there and seeing how that impacts what we do moving forward, how we live our lives, what we prioritize, what we do with our lives too. So there was that. And then also just the more knowledge we gain about the past, the more the present makes sense to us. And how things came to be, it's so important, because otherwise you live just in a world where you think it's just so easy to fix, and it's not.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I was explaining in my group with Hannah that this inquiry question originally came from a collaborative inquiry that I was working on with intermediate students, and with the teachers. We spent 2 half days coming up with this inquiry question. And what we wanted to make it was, originally it was very Indigenous specific. And then we kept stepping back and stepping back and stepping back and saying, if we make this question open enough, then we can include everything that we feel is important to include across the curriculum and tie everything together. And so I would invite you to consider, I mean, you're welcome to use that question, or you're welcome, I would suggest that you might want to use that strategy of asking, in what ways might we, when we come up with an inquiry, step back? Because sometimes I notice we talk about inquiry as a good method, because it invites creates a space for educators to learn alongside students. And still, I find that sometimes when people create an inquiry question, it's too specific. And you really want it to be broad enough that it could really sweep in a number of different curricular areas, and to be able to talk about Indigenous education and anti-racism and anti-oppression. So I agree, Mafusa. It was really interesting because the teachers wove it throughout a whole bunch of different areas. And please consider that. I'm happy to share that. Back here to sharing my screen. So when we're talking about how does knowing our past impact our present and our future actions, we have to think about what happened between pre-contact and today, and why don't we teach it. And so if you haven't seen this video, you can just do an online search of Dr. Susan Dion, the historical timeline as lesson, and she goes through and gives us 500 years of colonialism in about an hour, and really unpacks what people have been talking about in schools and what people have not been talking about, and why. And so I'd really, really highly recommend that you take a look at that. We have to be figuring out the ways what are we missing, whose voices are not in the courses that we're teaching, and recognizing that it is often by design. I wanted to show you this short video. I know some of you will have already seen it before, and I'm going back to Natasha Henry again, as I mentioned last time. But this is a really powerful short video, and I'm going to press play. And if someone could just in the chat tell me if you can hear it, because I know sometimes there's some wonky stuff that happens with videos. So really powerful short video of just taking our history books, and I'd challenge you to consider the resources that are being used. If you're an educator, what resources are you using yourself, and whose voices are missing from them? And and then in what ways are we making sure that we are finding resources that do include the voices of folks who are in the margins? So, um, what are the biggest barriers to doing this work in anti-colonialism and anti-racism, other than resources? So I've mentioned the resources that they're not coming from the video, or they're not being used, or we can't find them. What I'd like to see if people could put in the chat, what do you see are the biggest barriers to doing anti-racism and anti-colonial work? Well, thanks for popping that video in there, Maureen, the link for the Susan Dion. So what do you think are the biggest barriers to doing anti-racism, anti-colonial work? So I see the chat's getting populated. Thank you. Um, Closed minds, not wanting to give up our own power and privilege. Time to process the learning. Time is always the thing that we come back to. But even though if there's time, then we get into some of these other things like that I see on here, giving up own power and privilege, accountability, systemic racism. I don't know that that time is an issue there. That we could still have lots and lots of time, and then you'd still have systemic racism, still have a lack of accountability, bias, um, the lack of momentum. Yeah, that can be there for sure. Closed minds, bias, lack of self-reflection. Yeah, I think that's a tough one, Ruby, with the self-reflection, because sometimes if you don't know what you don't know, then it's hard to look back and reflect on it and see it, if you don't know. No structures in place to support, yeah, not understanding how systemic racism is embedded. That's an important one with Harpreet, that our systems are made, are designed, the foundations of education are designed to not change. And so then when those of us who are really trying to change it is like we're pushing against a concrete wall, and people don't recognize how deeply embedded it is. Yeah, Melanie, who needs to do the heavy lifting, hard work, vulnerability. Thank you. These are great. Um, yeah, the add-on. Oh yeah, that's a personal one that really upsets me when I'm asked to do something and it's really clear to me that it's a checkbox rather than someone who really wants to engage in the work. Taking the feedback, yeah, that is a vulnerability, right? If you're taking some feedback, um, being authentic when you aren't the voice that needs to be represented. I'm not quite sure what that means. If you could clarify that in the chat again. Um, yeah, misused language, white fragility. Thank you. This is really fantastic. I appreciate all of these and they're all barriers. Wow, that was really easy for folks to come up with a list of barriers. I am sure that most, if not all of you, have seen the work from Paul Gorski, Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. And so in this article that was in ASCD a couple of years ago, and which he has revised, and so I've put some of the detours on here that he's changed a little bit, but we have I would say some of these themes came up in the conversation that we were just having, pacing for privilege, right? And that comes up with comments like, they're not ready. And I'm thinking of any of the folks here, I guess I wonder how many people have heard that before, that they're not ready, and I don't even know sometimes who they are, but we're told they're not ready. That deficit ideology. We could talk forever about where we see the focus on deficits. Celebrating diversity, and we could talk forever about that, because that's all of those. Let's have a celebration of whatever day or month or week, and let's acknowledge that people, but we don't actually change any of the racist structures that are in our systems. But we've done this special day or evening. The shiny new program detour is one that I see a lot, and that's where whatever the latest and greatest fad is in education, where we're saying, oh, this new X, whatever X is going to make everything better. And so what we see then is that people jump from new program to new program to new program, instead of, again, focusing on what the really important things are. Individualizing racism, so it's that individual rather than a systemic issue. It's about class, not race detours. So I think many of the points that you raised, that all of you raised in the chat, come up here. Highly recommend this article. If anybody has the link to it and you can pop it in the chat for folks, I'll do it at the end, but if you could do it now, that would be really helpful. This is what I love that Gorski says at the end of that article. He then talks about, so how do we go about changing and redirecting on these detours? And this is what he says: fix injustice, not kids. So it's not the kids and families and communities aren't the problem, it's injustice that's the problem. So if we're always redirecting back to injustice, then we're going to be good. So how do we do that? How do we direct things back to injustice? And so I'm going to just share a couple of really important resources that can direct the work that we do. And one is the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And I apologize if anyone's tuning in who's not from Ontario, but I know that other provinces also have their own human rights commissions. And so it's really clear then what the policy is. Here we say on Ontario, we all live, work, and receive services with dignity, can contribute to society, and have equal access to opportunities without discrimination. And then it gets really specific as you read through it. The OHRC specifically refers to 5 areas of our lives, and one is social, which includes schools. So when we're looking at injustices or problematic practices that take place in schools, then I think we can start leaning on the Ontario Human Rights Commission to help fix the injustice. And then that's specific for Indigenous peoples, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that 14 and 15 specifically talk about education. So when we are saying, those of us who work in Indigenous education, that we have to make specific accommodations for Indigenous students and Indigenous communities. This isn't just coming from nowhere. This is coming from treaty rights, as we discussed last week during Treaties Recognition Week, and then it also comes from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we have the right to have this happening in schools, and the right for schools to consult and work in cooperation with Indigenous peoples to combat prejudice and eliminate discrimination. So we can lean on OHRC, we can lean on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then this is my favorite, one of my favorite things to talk about are our standards of practice as educators in Ontario and our ethical standards of practice. And so I think that if we are all following all of our standards of practice, then we're not going to get into situations where children are being treated inequitably, or they're being discriminated against, or they're not being, this is the one that's for respect. And these, I just love these drawings by Bruce Beardy, that he has these beautiful woodlands illustrations that go along with each of the standards of practice and the ethical standards of practice. But even without the illustrations, I think, I wonder how many people go back to these other than when you were, let's say, in the Faculty of Education and you were expected to take a look at that. So I'm just curious if people could put up their hand if they regularly come back to these standards of practice. So a couple of people do. And so if you don't, I invite you to come back to these. For those of you who work in positions of leadership in your school, and not just administrators, but any sort of leadership position, I would suggest that you could use these as a jumping off point for these conversations about doing equity work and anti-oppression and anti-racism and anti-colonialism in your schools. I hope that folks have seen this equity continuum. It's not, it's a little bit older. It's by Karen Murray and Nicole West Burns. And I'm just trying to remember the year. The year has just escaped me. 2011. So it's not brand new, and I'd say it's still relevant today. This is from the very beginning. What are the questions that need to be addressed in order for us to go deeper with this work? So I'd invite you to just populate the chat if you have any ideas on what questions you think need to be addressed for us to go deeper with this work. And I'll tell a little story while folks are thinking about that. When I first started doing this work 8 years ago, and I mentioned last time, I was also the equity lead, as in addition to being the Indigenous education lead, and for 2 boards. And I had to do a calendar, with dates of significance, because we were trying to get schools. I think this is better than it was then, better now than it was then, of really looking at days of significance for all different peoples and trying to plan accordingly when we're looking at school events. But I wanted this calendar to not just have those dates of significance. I also wanted it to be an invitation to do some work. And so what I did was I put different aspects from this document on each month and asked people to reflect on it. And I got almost no uptake on it. And I think it's one of those things where I was so excited about it and was thinking, oh, this is just so great, this continuum. Because it looks like this. I'm sorry the pictures aren't perfectly clear, but I'm guessing many of you, if you don't have the book yourself, it's probably available someplace in your school or your board. So it's divided into sections like school climate and culture of professional development. And what I love about it is this idea of like that the continuum is right there on the page. So why don't you mark yourself right now? Um, just like I invite people that when we start doing this work, um, with those working agreements that are at the beginning to invite yourself to move forward, that we're all in different places and we recognize that, and different places for different things. So you may be really ahead, almost fully in place of the culture of professional development, but your school climate still needs a bit of work because we're not going to be at the same place in all areas. And so I had shared this out, and then like almost nobody did it. And then um, so I was upset about that. And then now that I look back on it, I recognize that people didn't have most folks didn't have the background necessary to self-assess. So if you don't know what you don't know, then how do you assess yourself on that? Some of these I think are clearer, but I think that the work that's happened in my district, and I think in many districts over the last couple of years, would make it easier to complete this. And to complete it, I think important to do it as a team, because what could happen is that somebody could just be marking themselves all, in the number 4, and then, submitting that along with um, their school action plans or their school improvement plans. So the first one, school climate, here is the school responds quickly and practically to all issues of discrimination and structural inequities. And so they give some look fors, and then there's some place for you to add more look fors. And what I invite people to do in using this is to actually give really specific examples. Taking a look of where, what are your own examples here within your school and your practice. The culture of professional development in schools where teachers have very different life experiences from that of their students. Professional development must question the common sense assumptions about schooling. Notice that common sense is in quotes. This demands a new and different kind of professional development that is focused on learning about the lives of students and their families. Um, and this is the one that I want folks to think about. The school administration communicates, this is about leadership, communicates its visions clearly to all stakeholders. That vision articulates the notion that issues of equity and social justice are the pillars of the school's mission statement. And so what I'd like you to do is I'm going to pop you really quickly into groups, and what I'd like you to discuss in your group, and it's going to be really short, only 3 minutes. So a quick statement. Um, how do you see this happening in the school or your work site if you're not in a school? Uh, is there a vision that's clearly articulated to all stakeholders, and that within that vision, equity and social justice are pillars of that? And if the answer is no, and you say that really quickly, then I invite you to think about why do you think that might be. So we're talking about school leadership, we're talking about vision within a school, or it could be a system. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people to send you out into a 3-minute breakout room. Oops. Recreate. Okay, here we go. Timer getting set.
Hi, Dean. You're going to have to forgive me. My dog could not wait, so I'm literally out with a green baggie.
No worries.
I'll just be a moment. Sorry, he could not wait.
Oops, sorry. I was trying to move folks around because there were a couple people where they're here, but they're not here. There was one other person who was in a room, but where did she go? Oh, I moved her, but then I think Maria, you came back and now she's
I
gone
know
over
what
to
was
that
in the
room.
That's
Yeah, but
why.
I sent someone else there. Can you
Oh,
still
no.
join that room? Because now she's there.
Okay. Yes, I think I can. I'm joining. I'm going.
Okay. Okay.
The main work. Now, there was a special day that we should all have been observing for the community in general. And on that day, nothing should be sold, it should be given away. And they were teaching us this for a week at least. But when it came to the special day, it was blocked by a sale for fundraising. And it was, in many people's eyes, this was very insulting. And the boss jumped in immediately and apologized and said many nice things to correct our actions. And but that's only lately. But you have to ask yourself, with what happened in Peel and this and that, are people just doing this for show? And you have to wonder what's happening when the light's not on them. What are they doing then? That's the question I'd like answered. I hope I wasn't.
Oh, that's a great one. I think that, you know, that's a question many of us have, Martin, around the tokenism and yeah, what do people do when no one's looking? So that's great. Thank you. I have a couple more slides for us to finish off with their conversations tonight. So we already talked about this. Is Martin, you did a perfect segue into this more than a checklist. So it's really important to do your own learning. And to invite your colleagues along for that learning. I'm going to share this link. We, a number of us co-authored, and Judy's on here, and I was part of this. Melissa Wilson started it, an annotated bibliography, a resource for Ontario educators learning about racism. And there's Judy again, that we start our next anti-racist educator reads next week with George Day's anti-racism education theory and practice. So I hope that folks would consider learning alongside us. I will make sure and put the link in, if you hang around for a minute, for both of those into the chat once we're done. I mean, it's about our humanity, this work. Thank you. to our sponsor, Intel. So we really appreciate that we have sponsors who make these free sessions available to you. And a session survey. And Dean, do you have a prize?
I
And
do.
I'll put the survey in, Dean. If you just wait, Dean will wait.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I'll put the link into the chat. We really need people to do the surveys if we want to get continued support. So I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, just put a link in the chat if you would love to. My good friend Katina, who I think was here for a moment, she is gonna gift someone with an Uber Eats card if you want. So click on that link, type your name in real quick. I'll gather the names in a few seconds. But yeah, if you wouldn't mind, once Kalinda can get that link in there for the survey, even if you don't fill it out right now, because it's a little bit of work that goes into it. We would love for you to do that. I also just want to give a quick plug for, I see Haley is here today, and Haley is actually going to be one of our next presenters at the end of November, looking at I think some really cool stuff, looking at nature, looking at equity, looking at Indigenous learning, kind of how that all works together. So I know there's going to be some really practical things for people in there. So I think there's a connection between her work and what Kalinda's been sharing, as well as many of the offerings that we've had recorded. So you're welcome to go back and look at that at any time. All right, I'll see who's populated our list here. Gather the names. Oh, they're still coming in. I just better wait. I saw a few before come in. I'll just wait a few seconds.
So I put the survey in there and then I put the bibliography in there for people. So please grab that annotated bibliography and the survey.
All right. Thank you again for your time here today. We appreciate you doing that. All right. Okay. I'm spinning the wheel now. You'll just have to trust me with the winner. And it is Judy. Awesome.
Yay!
I had the privilege of having a little chat with Judith last time. She's a wonderful person. And I also got somebody else. By the way, I mentioned that, and somebody in British Columbia said Judith McEwen. And so, anyways, you're a big deal.
You're darn right. So
All right.
thank you. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your time.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.